For nearly 6 decades, Dolly Parton's name echoed across the world. Her voice, her rhinestones, her hair, all unmistakable. But through it all, one name stayed whispered: Carl Dean, her husband, her mystery, her most loyal companion. Who was he, really? He never gave interviews, never attended award shows, never stood beside her on red carpets. Some fans questioned if he even existed, but Dolly insisted he was always there, just off stage, watching from the shadows. Now, at 79 years old, Dolly Parton is finally breaking her silence about the one man who's stayed by her side through fame, fortune, and firestorms. In this opening chapter, we step into the enigma that is Carl Dean, unseen, unheard, but never unfelt. This isn't just a story about marriage. It's a story about loyalty, sacrifice, and a bond so private that even the world's biggest star chose to keep it hidden. Until now, of all the mysteries that swirl around Dolly Parton's life, the wigs, the surgeries, the rumored affairs, none have captured the public's imagination quite like Carl Dean. Fans knew his name, but not his face. Even paparazzi, with their relentless cameras, could barely catch a glimpse of him. For decades, Dolly remained fiercely protective of him, often joking that he chose me, not my career, and that he preferred mowing the lawn to walking a red carpet. But why such secrecy? Why the near-total erasure of Carl Dean from public view? As Dolly opens up at 79, we begin to understand that it wasn't about hiding shame or embarrassment. It was about shielding something pure. Carl Dean, a man born in Tennessee just like Dolly, was a rugged, quiet soul. He ran an asphalt paving business and had no interest in showbiz. The very idea of Hollywood made him cringe, and yet he fell in love with one of the most glamorous women in the world. From their first meeting outside the wishy-washy laundromat in Nashville in 1964, something clicked. He wasn't dazzled by her potential fame. He was captivated by her heart. Their first date wasn't at a fancy restaurant or a concert. It was a drive through the Tennessee backroads in Carl's pickup truck. No cameras, no fans, just two young souls laughing and dreaming under the southern sky. Dolly once admitted that Carl told her on their wedding day, "I'll never stand in your light, but I'll always be behind you." And he meant it. Over the years, Carl avoided all spotlight. He didn't accompany Dolly to events, didn't do interviews, and never once used her fame for his own gain. While tabloids speculated he didn't exist, he was at home in the Smoky Mountains, keeping the garden alive and feeding the dogs. And that's exactly how Dolly wanted it. She respected his desire for privacy and loved him more for it. Their relationship was built on opposites. Her spark, his stillness, her global fame, his reclusive peace. And as she explains now, Carl gave her the one thing no one else could: a sanctuary, a quiet place to be herself. Not Dolly Parton, the icon, but Dolly, the girl from Locust Ridge. For a woman constantly performing, Carl was the one soul she never had to perform for. Behind the rhinestones, wigs, and laughter, Dolly Parton's love story with Carl Dean was rooted in something so ordinary it almost didn't feel real. And yet, that's exactly what made it last. Dolly has always said, "My songs are dramatic, but my life at home is not." And Carl? He was the calm in the middle of her global storm. At 79, Dolly is finally admitting just how deep his influence ran, not just in her personal life, but in the heart of her music. You won't find Carl's name in liner notes or award speeches, but listen closely to the lyrics of songs like "From Here to the Moon and Back," and you'll hear him, you'll feel him. That song, in particular, was written for him. And for someone who refused to be in the spotlight, Carl quietly became the muse behind some of Dolly's most emotional and enduring ballads. Their love wasn't broadcast. It was written into melodies, tucked between verses, hidden in the way Dolly's voice cracked on certain lines, and no one even realized it. Dolly has revealed that Carl didn't even like her music. "He's not necessarily one of my biggest fans," she once joked. "He likes Led Zeppelin and bluegrass," but that didn't matter. Carl didn't love the entertainer. He loved the girl who came home and kicked off her heels, the one who made cornbread from scratch and laughed at old reruns of The Andy Griffith Show. That unconditional love grounded Dolly in a way fame never could. But the biggest surprise came when Dolly opened up about just how much she protected Carl in return. When she did photo shoots or interviews at their home, she'd ask crews to stay clear of the backyard. That was his domain. She even designed their house so he had private exits and could avoid the chaos. There was no resentment in this arrangement. In fact, Dolly found it romantic. "He's like a ghost," she once laughed. "But he's my ghost." And yet, not everything was always picture perfect. There were hard times, long tours, health scares, and the weight of two very different worlds colliding. But their relationship endured not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Carl never tried to change Dolly, and Dolly never tried to drag Carl into a world he didn't want. Their love survived because it didn't need to be public to be powerful. Now, at 79, Dolly's words carry more weight. As she speaks about Carl, her voice softens. It's not the voice of a country legend. It's the voice of a woman who knows she found her one true constant in a world that never stops spinning. Of all the things Dolly Parton has built, her legendary career, Dollywood, and a music empire spanning 6 decades, perhaps the most remarkable was the invisible wall she constructed around her marriage to Carl Dean. It wasn't made of stone or steel. It was made of silence, boundaries, and fierce love. And for years, that silence sparked endless rumors. Was Carl even real? Were they really together? Was it all an image? But now, at 79, Dolly is finally lifting the veil, and the truth is even stranger and more beautiful than the speculation. Carl Dean was not a ghost, but he might as well have been. He never walked a red carpet. He never stood in the audience at the CMAs. He didn't attend album release parties or Nashville industry galas. Most of Dolly's team never met him, but he was always there, quietly, behind the scenes, waiting at home with a smile and a joke. When fans wondered if Dolly was keeping a secret, the answer was yes. But not the kind they expected. The secret wasn't scandal, it was sanctuary. In interviews, Dolly has started sharing rare glimpses of that world, like how Carl would write her little poems and leave them on the kitchen table, or how he built her a stone fire pit in their backyard, just so she could roast marshmallows when she couldn't sleep. These weren't grand gestures, they were personal, intimate, and deeply ordinary, and that's exactly what Dolly cherished. "He's always loved me just the way I am," she once said. "No makeup, no wig, just me." Perhaps the most touching revelation came when Dolly described how Carl reacted to her fame. He never felt threatened, never asked her to quit, but he also never pretended to care about the spotlight. In fact, Dolly once admitted that Carl has only seen her perform once in concert, early in her career. He said, "He didn't want to see me work. He wanted to see me as his girl, not the performer." That one statement revealed everything. But Dolly's protection of Carl wasn't just about love. It was about survival. In a world where celebrity marriages are devoured by tabloids, Dolly knew their bond had to be kept sacred. She created 2 lives, one for the cameras and one just for Carl. And while the public adored her for the rhinestones and charm, Carl adored her for the woman underneath it all. Now, as Dolly reflects on their decades together, the real story begins to emerge, not one of isolation, but of incredible intentionality. Carl Dean was never Dolly's shadow. He was her anchor. And their love wasn't hidden because it was fragile. It was hidden because it was too powerful to be shared with the world. There was always a quiet poetry to the way Dolly Parton spoke about Carl Dean. Brief mentions here and there, always respectful, always affectionate, but never quite pulling back the curtain. For decades, the mystery only deepened as Dolly's fame skyrocketed. She became a global icon, beloved for her music, her business empire, her philanthropy, and her unmatched charisma. Yet, the man she loved most stayed entirely out of view. That kind of restraint in the celebrity world was almost unheard of, and it made the myth of Carl Dean all the more compelling. But the real revelation came not in a television interview or a headline-grabbing memoir, but in Dolly's decision to finally share their wedding photos on their 50th anniversary. It was one of the most unexpected and touching moments in country music history. After half a century of shielding Carl from the spotlight, Dolly finally opened the family album. And what fans saw wasn't Hollywood glamour. It was sincerity. A simple, beautiful moment frozen in time. Dolly in a modest gown, Carl in a suit, both beaming like two kids in love. That photograph told a truth more powerful than 1,000 rumors. In that moment, Dolly wasn't the queen of country. She was just a wife, deeply in love with the same man she met outside a Nashville laundromat in 1964. And Carl wasn't a mystery anymore. He was real, honest, still fiercely private, but now, finally, part of the story she was ready to tell. Dolly has since opened up about their strange and beautiful relationship dynamic. Carl, she says, has always been her biggest fan, just not in public. He listens to every album, offers unfiltered feedback, and often jokes that he prefers her rock and roll songs to the country hits. He supported her decisions, even the bold ones. When she posed for Playboy in the 1970s, Carl didn't object. In fact, he framed the cover and kept it in his private office for years, not because of vanity, but because he was proud of her boldness, proud of her courage. They've faced health scares, industry pressure, and the long loneliness that comes from spending months apart. But what kept them going was humor and loyalty. Dolly says Carl makes her laugh every day, sometimes when she needs it most. And unlike many celebrity couples, they never pretended to be perfect. They simply refused to let the outside world define their bond. Carl Dean wasn't absent from Dolly's life. He was its heartbeat, steady, unseen, and always there. And now, at 79, as Dolly allows that truth to come into the light, the world is finally understanding the full picture. The rhinestones, the wigs, the stadium tours, they were part of the legend. But Carl was home. Carl Dean didn't just stay out of the spotlight. He made a point to disappear from it entirely. No interviews, no red carpet appearances, not even blurry tabloid photos. For most fans, his face was less familiar than Dolly's wigs. And yet, Dolly never described this as strange or strained. In fact, she insisted it was part of the very reason their marriage lasted. According to her, the moment Carl saw how fast fame was wrapping itself around Dolly, he decided to step aside and let her shine fully, without interference. He wasn't intimidated by her success, he admired it. But he also had no desire to be caught in the chaos of public life. Behind the scenes, however, Carl played an integral role in Dolly's world. He helped her make big decisions, always grounded her with common sense, and gave her space to be vulnerable in a world that constantly demanded she be strong. One of Dolly's most striking revelations came during an old radio interview that resurfaced online. "I'd come off the road, exhausted and worn out, and Carl would just hand me a grilled cheese sandwich and say, 'Sit your little behind down.' And somehow, that made me feel like everything was okay again." Carl's presence in her life was like that sandwich. Simple, comforting, and full of love. He didn't need the world to see him. He just needed Dolly to know he was there. The couple's home life was far removed from the glittering fantasy people might expect. They spent quiet nights watching TV, reading, and gardening. Carl, an avid car enthusiast, spent hours tinkering with his vehicles, while Dolly often wrote songs in her pajamas. They'd take long drives through the Tennessee hills, sometimes without speaking much, just enjoying the hum of the road and the silence of understanding. That simplicity, that consistency, was their secret weapon in an industry built on noise. Even Dolly's legendary theme park, Dollywood, was something Carl had mixed feelings about. He supported it, loved seeing it thrive, but he only visited once. Crowds weren't his thing. He preferred the solitude of his farm, the company of dogs, and the whisper of trees over the roar of roller coasters. As Dolly turned 79, she looked back at her life not just as a country music icon, but as a wife. And what she said stunned many. "Carl gave me the one thing no one else could, a place to be myself." That's a powerful thing to admit after decades of being everyone else's fantasy. But for Dolly, it was the truth. In a world that often demands performance, Carl gave her permission to just exist. And now, after all these years, Dolly is finally letting the world into that private paradise she guarded so fiercely. A paradise built not on fame, but on the quiet, steady love of a man who never needed applause. For years, people speculated whether Carl Dean even existed. Was he a myth? A character Dolly invented to keep her private life sacred? After all, in nearly 6 decades of marriage, he appeared in no red carpet photos, gave no interviews, and refused even the smallest public gesture of recognition. But according to Dolly, that was by design. "Carl isn't imaginary," she once laughed. "He's just invisibly loyal." Behind that invisibility was a love story so rare, it almost feels fictional. Carl Dean wasn't interested in Dolly's fame, her fortune, or the empire she built. He didn't want to control it. He just wanted her to survive it. He would jokingly tell her, "You go out and make the money. I'll stay here and make the sandwiches." And while that might sound like a quip, it masked a much deeper truth. Carl Dean gave Dolly something she couldn't get from anyone else in the industry: normalcy. When she came home after performing to tens of thousands of fans, Carl didn't treat her like a goddess. He treated her like Dolly, the girl he met at the wishy-washy laundromat in Nashville in 1964. She'd come home still buzzing with sequins and spotlight, and Carl would be sitting on the porch with a dog at his feet, a fishing pole nearby, and a plate of cornbread waiting. That grounded her. That reminded her who she was underneath the rhinestones and platinum records. He kept her secrets. He held her tears. And when she doubted herself, he reminded her that success hadn't changed the woman he fell in love with. Even when she contemplated plastic surgery, or worried her image was fading, Carl would simply say, "You looked better to me when you were wearing overalls and had chicken feed in your hair." That wasn't just country charm. It was deep, unwavering love. Dolly often said that Carl never once asked her for anything. Not a song, not a name drop, not a backstage pass. He didn't want anything from her career, because he knew she already gave it all to the world. What he wanted was the piece she kept for herself, and that was the part he protected with a quiet, loyal kind of fierceness that made her feel safe. When Dolly started opening up about Carl more in recent interviews, fans were stunned, not just by the stories, but by the realization that the most private part of Dolly's life might have been the most beautiful. Carl Dean was more than just the man behind the curtain. He was the heart behind the legend. And at 79, Dolly seemed finally ready to say out loud what she'd kept close for decades: that her greatest love story wasn't one she sang about, but one she lived in silence. When Dolly Parton turned 79, something shifted in how she talked about Carl Dean. It was as if she'd been holding in decades of memories, some too tender, some too painful, and some too strange to share while they were still unfolding. But now, with the twilight of her career in sight, Dolly seemed ready to let the world peek behind the curtain of her marriage. And what people saw wasn't just love. It was mystery, mischief, and moments that nearly changed everything. Dolly admitted that there were times she and Carl almost gave up, not because of betrayal or scandal, but because being the wife of Dolly Parton meant sacrificing anonymity, freedom, and any sense of normalcy. She recalled a stretch in the late 70s when Carl packed a bag and disappeared for 3 days, leaving nothing but a note that read, "I need to breathe." Dolly didn't call the police. She didn't panic. She waited. When he returned, she didn't yell. She just asked, "Are you done breathing?" And Carl, with that dry grin of his, said, "For now." It was one of those moments where love didn't need drama, just space. But perhaps the most shocking story came when Dolly confessed that she and Carl had quietly renewed their vows not once, but 3 times over the decades, in private ceremonies, in places no one ever suspected. The first was in their backyard, the second was in a tiny chapel in the Smoky Mountains, and the third in a hospital room, when Carl had a health scare that nearly took him from her. He was hooked up to every machine you can imagine, Dolly said, her voice cracking, but he squeezed my hand and said, "If this is it, marry me again." A nurse served as their witness. Dolly wore no makeup, no gown, just a hospital visitor badge and a tear-streaked face. That was Carl Dean. No flash, no spotlight, just quiet devotion. She also shared how Carl kept every love letter she ever wrote him, locked away in a wooden box under their bed, even ones scribbled on napkins or candy wrappers. "I never knew until I tripped on the box one night," she said. "He'd saved them all." And in that moment, she realized that while she had given her voice to the world, Carl had kept her words, the private ones, for himself. Now, as she enters her 80s, Dolly is slowly unpacking that treasure chest of memories. She's choosing to share stories that once belonged to just the two of them, and with every new detail, it becomes clearer. Carl Dean wasn't just Dolly's husband. He was her hidden sanctuary, a man who never wanted to be famous, but ended up becoming the most legendary mystery in country music history. In her most revealing moment yet, Dolly Parton sat down in a quiet corner of her Tennessee home and finally opened up about the question that had haunted fans for decades. Why did Carl Dean stay in the shadows for so long? For years, people speculated wildly. Some claimed Carl didn't exist at all, that Dolly had fabricated him to maintain an image of wholesome devotion. Others whispered about secret divorces, double lives, and Hollywood-style scandal. But Dolly had never cared much for rumors. She let people believe what they wanted, until now. At 79, Dolly finally told the truth. Carl Dean wasn't hiding from fame. He was protecting her from it. She explained that in the early days of her career, she'd bring Carl along to events and red carpets. But the attention, the cameras, the pressure, it made him physically sick. At one event in the late 60s, after being mobbed by photographers, Carl reportedly locked himself in a hotel bathroom for hours. Dolly recalled sitting on the floor outside the door, listening to him breathe heavily, knowing she'd have to choose, take him along for the ride or let him stay behind and preserve their love. She chose love. From that point forward, Carl stopped going to events. He stopped giving interviews. He built a life of quiet devotion, showing his love in private ways. He'd leave notes in Dolly's lunchbox, mow the lawn in the shape of hearts, and wait up for her after long tours just to heat up her dinner. But the most emotional part came when Dolly revealed Carl's last request. "He told me," she said, holding back tears, "when I go, don't tell anyone right away. Take some time. Grieve without the cameras." That moment hasn't come yet, but Dolly said she's prepared. And when it does, she'll honor his wish, just like she's honored his life, with silence, with song, and with a love story too big for the tabloids. As she stared out at the Tennessee hills from her porch, Dolly gave a rare, vulnerable smile. "He was my greatest love, my biggest secret, and the only thing I never had to share, until now." And with that, she let the mystery end. Not with fireworks, but with grace, just like Carl would have wanted.